internet, the psychologist casual review, and today we're going to be reviewing The Matrix of the Mind by Thomas Ogden. So in this very interesting book, he's going to present, debate and discuss the principles of many previous psychoanalysts, mainly object relations based. So who is going to talk about these? Of course, Melanie Klein and her ideas, Fairbairn, Winnicott, and Bion. But he's also going to sprinkle a bit of Freud and Abraham. So what I found of high interest is that he's going to start off with Kleinian theory, as it's maybe not, she's not the first to have talked about object relations. It was Abraham, but she was the real one to really kick-start it, right, and really give it its importance as we know it today. So for her, basically there's two positions of the mind. Schizoparanoid, or paranoid-schizoid in good English, because I always mix up both, and the depressive position. Both positions are not to be understood as a developmental line, i.e. it's not something that the child learns and then grows out of. The potential always stays within. And what Ogden points out is that we shouldn't consider it something of an acquisition. It's something in the mind that's there, and it's there from the get-go for Klein. And Ogden explains it through the same argument as deep structural language knowledge. Deep structures that Chomsky developed, i.e. that the child already from the get-go has patterns in their minds that allows them to understand and to build language. Something that is not tabula rasa, but there's something there. There's something in a way that's inherent to human constitution. If you've read Jung, it's a bit like that. The idea of archetypes, i.e. something that's a baseline for the whole of humanity. And he says that Kleinian ideas might be linked to this baseline of humanity, that everyone has them and their preconceived patterns. But they're not to understand that the baby sings, for example, the very breast. It's not as simple as that. It's much more subtle and nuanced. It's just that baby understands that there is risks, threats from the get-go. And that threat is also other humans, i.e. the caregivers. And so what Ogden explains is that you shouldn't reduce Kleinian thinking to the most superficial understanding, that it's much deeper than that, and it goes through much more layers. And one of the layers he's going to explore is the paranoid-schizoid. I apologize for this. In French it's schizoparanoid, and in English it's paranoid-schizoid. So I'm always going to mix them up. The idea behind the paranoid-schizoid position is that the child at the very beginning does not have the tools, the mental tools, to distinguish a caregiver from themselves, i.e. they're merged. That what the caregiver does is what the infant does, and vice versa, therefore creating a space in which basically they're intertwined. Therefore, if the caregiver's bad, therefore the baby's bad, and there's no difference between them. And basically, he says that it's something that can be seen even after the development of the second position. For example, in patients who have a form of regression to the paranoid-schizoid position, namely, for example, the schizophrenics and the borderlines. And he remarks something that I found very interesting and very clinically true, and I can confirm this, is that in those moments of paranoid-schizoid developments in those patients, the I disappears, vanishes, replaced by something of a collective we, or something even without pronouns, or without even, the person is just going to say this bad or this good, and you're not really going to know if they're talking about themselves, they're talking about the institution, they're talking about someone else. Something seems vague, very almost as if you were lost in the mist. And I think that Ogden pointed out very well that fundamentally the paranoid-schizoid position makes it that there's a merger, meaning that there's no differentiation. Therefore, it seems lost even to us clinicians when we hear them, when we listen to them. So that's a very interesting point he made in this book. He also says that you shouldn't spoil Kleinian theory by trying to make it more palatable or more trivial. You have to really understand it as a psychic elaboration that the baby is not thinking about, he's experiencing, i.e. he's living those fears. We're not talking about something that's abstract for the baby, or that the baby is kind of intellectualizing and put it at a distance. What he's feeling is at his core. It's an experience he's making. Then he basically goes on to speak about the depressive position, and how, if we were to make it accurate, it should be more called the grieving position, i.e. the moment where the baby renounces this merger, the baby renounces this all-powerfulness to develop the fact that he is separate from the caregiver, separate from mother, that they are not one and the same, and that mother has her life and he has his life, which creates, of course, a sadness, but also a form of understanding, and also a distance enough for empathy, for compassion, for love, and all of those positive feelings. And the negative are still there, right? But they're not only there. There's a mixture of both. And this is what's going to open up to ambivalence, as I was talking about last week, and fundamentally a more of a fluid and flexible mindset. So he thinks that Klein theory is immensely important to understand the mentality of very regressed patients and of very young children. However, he does have his criticisms, because for him, and I agree with this from my own reading of Klein, is that Klein is kind of very ambivalent on what does object relations mean. Does it mean that it's purely internal, that the parents don't even matter, and that it's only internalized objects, i.e. the internal parents that have a say, and that it's only like fantasies and unconscious beliefs, completely detached, devoid of any reality of the parent? Is it that the parent is internalized and thus it creates the fantasy? Is it that the fantasy itself is made possible by the presence of the parent? So we don't know to what extent the baby and the fantasies of the baby of the paranoid-schizoid position or the depressive position are to do with the external world. And he says that that's something that's very confusing, because Klein does back and forths between that question. At some point she says that the parent is incredibly important, the real parent. Sometimes says that it's irrelevant. What is important is the unconscious fantasy and the development of that fantasy. So it's unclear. And I will say that indeed Klein does back and forths and doesn't really settle on a technical answer. What I would say is that both are important, both are valuable, but if there's bad parents in the real world, it does affect infinitely more, at least in my perspective, the object relations of within, i.e. those fundamental imagoes that are there from the get-go are still altered or rendered more powerful by bad objects. So I will say that there is an effect, at least that's my position on it, but Klein doesn't settle. So he moves on to Fairbairn to say that Fairbairn, one of the greatest achievements of Fairbairn was to say that it isn't just that we are integrating objects alone. No. It's our states of self with the object, i.e. there's a dyad. There's a dyad that's self-fundamental, in which basically we integrate both a good side of ourselves with the good parent, bad side of ourselves with the bad parent, and that both go together, i.e. if parent is bad, I am bad. If I am good, parent is good. And that's what Fairbairn really points out, that he really gives this whole dynamic of it's not just an object that's integrated, it's the relationship towards the object, which is paramount and was really a breakthrough. However, again, he's going to say that the problem with Fairbairn is that we don't know where the mental energy comes from, because for Fairbairn, the libido is object-seeking, but there's no id. So for Freud, it's very simple. There's the id that gives all the energy, and then the ego feeds off the id, right? In an unconscious way. But the energy, all of the mental energy, comes from the id and the pleasure principle. But because Fairbairn broke from that, the question is, where does the energy come from? Where does those instances what are they? I mean, what power is it, right? So very interesting perspective, even though I think it's more of a technical limitation of Fairbairn system rather than something that prevents clinically its use. So then he moves on to Bion, in which he says that the big achievement of Bion was to think in terms of something that needs to be contained, like, for example, something that's traumatic, like the beta element, and containment, the alpha function, i.e., something needs to be contained in the mind. Fantasies need to be created in order to give a form of envelope to experience, a form of containment of bad experiences and of good ones as representations go. Because, as basically, I'm going on something else, but as Kernburn pointed out, is that basically we create time in our minds because we want to re-experience the good sins. And this is part of what Bion is on about also. We create containments for both good and bad experiences because we want to be able to re-experience the good elements, but be able to minimize or to push back the bad ones, or to at least give them a more bearable sense towards ourselves. Now that we have talked about the major ones, there's one last one that Ogden really emphasizes in this book. It's Donald Wood's Winnicott, which he thinks that he went even a step further, seeing that basically mother and child are merged, but at the beginning. That it's a merger, and the unmerging happens slowly, but that happens because the mother slowly replaces this merging with something else, something transitional. What Winnicott has called a transitional object, i.e., it can be a doll, it can be a bear, but it's that object that's going to be allow the child to basically move on from mother to something else, a potential space. And he will basically, the last 50 pages of the book are basically the development of that potential space, i.e. a space in which the child can play alone, can be alone, but still daydream about mother, that they can still imagine something, produce something. They're not in the factual, they're no longer stuck in I need mother. It's more like I can daydream about mother. And this feeds in brilliantly, perfectly into the clinical work that we do with patients, because basically, as there's going to be a potential space, there's going to be a dream space, i.e. the patient is going to dream, and that dream, that nocturnal dream, right? I'm not talking about daydream, I'm really talking about night dreams. Night dreams are a form of experience in the world. They're not just there for the symbol and the symbolized. They're also there for the core experience it brings to the dreamer. That we often forget that. We want to analyze the dream as a set of symbols. But it's much more than that. It's also a lived experience. And that's what Ogden points out in this book, is that dream potential is also intertwined with how the parent-child relationship develops, which is very interesting because he points out that often schizophrenic do have dreams, both the daydreams and night dreams, but because they're lost in a world of neo-realities, the night dreams are mixed up for hallucinations, meaning that for Ogden, the hallucination is a form of dream, and the dream is a form of hallucination, that the experience is no longer delineated, i.e. they're not separate, they're part of the same. And schizophrenic, and he gives this example of a schizophrenic that would wake up saying, I've been murdered, but he was dreaming of being killed, but he never was. And yet he considered himself to have been murdered by the staff of the hospital when he was dreaming about it. So it's a very interesting and important perspective that he brings, that there's a merger between dreaming and hallucination. But he says that in the case of neurotic patients or borderline patients, it's more about that potential experience that's lived as it is of creating symbols, that the mind creates symbols for itself and it tries to transform, and there's that transformative element. And even though he doesn't talk about it, I'm going to add this to the conversation. We can also see that in post-traumatic stress disorder, the dreams are not transformed. They're not symbolized. They are the raw experience in of itself, the sin in itself à la Kant, right? Meaning that they are the phenomena, raw, untransformed, unrefined, just the sin in itself, the phenomena, bam, that sort of like traumatic experience that is undigestible. And I think that there is a parallel to be made in the fact that dreams are transformative and are a transformative experience for the dreamer. Because for Ogden, he talks about schizophrenia, that it's untransformed, it's just a continuum of hallucination. But I think that another example of this is post-traumatic stress disorder, in which dreams are basically untransformed events that repeats. So there's something to that, I think. And the last thing he really emphasizes is the therapeutic space, the analytic space, in which it's going to be a reactualization of the potential space in which the patient can daydream about the psychotherapeutic relationship, his ideas, the exchange with the therapist, that he can imagine scenes with the therapist like not paying the sessions and not feeling abandoned. And all of that daydream consolidates something of a third party, something that just basically, and what he will later call the analytic third, right? Basically this link, this space between the mind of the therapist and the mind of the patient, which I found brilliant. And I've always liked this idea that both parties create something new together, which is in of itself something that is created when the mother and the child diffuse. They create this form of third space in which the child can be alone and he has the ability to be alone. And this was a very interesting and very important read. So at the very core, this read is absolutely not for beginners. Even though he goes into the histories of the fairies and the applications, it is very, very technical. Maybe more so than his other books like The Sensing Something Human, which still remains technical, I'm not saying, but it's not this level of technical. He also talks about this question of symbols, that the mind can only create symbols once there's a form of separation, because symbols imply that you're not in the scene in itself, you're already like detached from it, you're already creating something else. And if you're not, then you completely merge with the object. And for him, for example, and I found this very interesting, fetishists, perverts, sexual perverts, don't really diffuse, they don't really create a symbol. And the symbol that they create through the fetish is kind of dead, as they can't really play with it. It has a sacred element to it, which is very interesting. And he does explain with Lacan's symbolic order that it's something that is developed through the development of the infant and through the renunciation of the mother and of this space of complete merger. He also talks about maternal preoccupation, a moment where basically it's as if psychosis had triggered in women in which they feel merged with their baby. And he says that, and he quotes Winnicott, this is completely normal in the first moments of life, but the whole perspective of a parent is to be able to slowly but surely disentangle it. But it can't be like brutal. It has to be slowly but surely, letting the child go, live its experiences, let it be itself and develop its sense of self. And I found that to be very true, very clinically pertinent. He also gives a myriad of clinical examples, which does help to illustrate his perspective, which is something that is always welcoming, especially in a text of that technical nature. So to make a quick summary, it's a very good book, very interesting, but expect to be challenged intellectually while reading it. But if you're up for a challenge, this is a great book. And it goes so well into this idea of object relations that it's well worth reading, at least according to me. So basically that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. Also, I should just say that about that Chomsky bit, I am not a philosopher, and I've done minimal research. I can't really talk on that, but that's the example he gives of deep language structures. Anyway, that's pretty much it. I'll see you in the next one.